The 4 free lunches of investing. All right, so I was listening to my man Bill Bengen, being interviewed by some lady, Afford Anything, or something like that, the YouTube channel, or I can't remember. And this is an okay interview, nothing wrong with that. Bill Bengen, though, and I'm a fan, long time, first time, but he said something that just sticks in my craw. This idea there's a free lunch in investing. In fact, who was it, Markowitz or Sharp? One of those guys got the Nobel Prize for this. And it's just not true. And the irony was that 5 minutes later, after Bill Bengen said this, he turned around and said, well, none of these are foolproof. They don't work all the time. And I said, well, if they don't work all the time, inherently they're not a free lunch. A free lunch is something that should work all the time, and that's what makes it a free lunch. Anyway, the premise of the free lunch would be that you can get better withdrawal rates on your retirement with less risk. And I'm just like, it's just not true, man. There is no free lunch at retirement investing. There isn't. So his 4 free lunches, the first one was a glide path. And essentially what a glide path is that, oh boy, I don't have a thing to wipe this off with, so I'll just use whatever this is. Essentially what a glide path is you start, all right, problem. Let's say you're normally a 70-30 investor, 70% stocks, 30% bonds. Well, you start retirement, 60 bonds and 40 stocks, something like this. And what you're doing is that you're slowly, when you're withdrawing all from the bond side. So you're pulling money out of this guy right here, boink, boink, boink. And ultimately, this will switch. Then you'll have more heavy in stocks and less heavy in bonds. That's what the ultimate strategy would be. I like that strategy. It's a good way to reduce sequence of turn stock risk, but it doesn't work all the time. It just doesn't work all the time. And we just know this simply because bonds just got absolutely pummeled from 1948 to basically 1968. They got absolutely destroyed. You see what I'm saying? So you can't say it's a free lunch. Then there's no interest rate in bonds for the last 15, 20 years or something like that. So I get the gist of it, but that certainly isn't going to reduce risk and give you a better withdrawal rate. It just, it could, and it probably does more often than not, but it's not a free lunch. And it annoys me. In fact, I'll give you an example of this. I'm now about 80-20, and some guy said, I thought you're, what did he say? I thought you were 65-35 or something like that. And I said, I was. But this S&P, the VTI is up 27% year to date. All right, so my VTI has grown significantly more than my bonds have. So inherently, I'm now gone from 65-35 to 80-20. And I'll take that any day of the week. So my portfolio is theoretically more aggressive now. And it is, but more aggressive because I made a whole lot more money. So that's a good place to be. All right, so that's free lunch number 1. Free lunch number 2 is the idea of diversification. Oh, that's driving me crazy again. The idea that diversification would give you higher return potential, i.e. in terms of withdrawals with less risk. Come on, man. Come on. Just look at the last 15 years. I mean, look, from 2000 to 2009, give a perfect example with Craig Israelson, 712 portfolio. It did great relative to risk versus return relative to just the S&P 500. Diversifications, you have stocks, bonds, all this stuff. 712 portfolio did great. The last 15 years, it got skunked by a 100% S&P or a VTI portfolio. It just did. Then you go back to 1929, 30, 31, 32, the whole Great Depression there. The S&P 500 just got skunked. Bonds did okay, all right? And so you can say the diversification worked, but did it really work? Relative to what? Being all in stocks, all in bonds? I don't think so. And then we go back again to 1948 to 1968, basically 1970, where the bonds just got smoked. If you were all in the S&P 500, you kicked ass and took names. The last 15 years, you kicked ass and took names. We're talking, these are long times, man, of being in retirement. Stocks just outperform bonds significantly for a significant amount of time. Now, again, it didn't always work like that, but the facts are you can't say diversification is a free lunch. You can't. Now, there was times when international did better than stocks, 100%. There's times when, I'll get to this here, another one here in just a second. Other things have done better. But the facts are you can't sit there and say diversification will give you, as a free lunch, more withdrawal potential and less risk. You just can't. We've had 15 years now that just simply hasn't been true. And then we had from the late 40s to the basically beginnings of the 70s that wasn't true. All right, Pablo Silva. All right, then we got rebalancing. And how can rebalancing be a free lunch if at the same time the equity glide path is a free lunch? Because the equity glide path is inherently not a rebalancing. So that doesn't make sense. Those two things are mutually exclusive. You can't have an equity glide path and a rebalancing every year either. I think rebalancing is way overdrawn. I mean, if you would have rebalanced for the last 15 years, did it give you higher distribution amounts and less risk? No, it just did not, man. You had just, again, I've already described for you, and we're not even going back to the 1870s. The 1870s, the S&P was getting trounced. And so just the whole thing about rebalancing, giving you free lunch, it's just, you can't have these two things, like the rebalancing gives you free lunch and the equity glide path does as well. Those two things can't exist together. So this whole, you can rebalance, I don't have a problem with that. But one of the things that kind of bothered me about Bill is he said, basically things that have gone up have a tendency to go down, essentially. I'm paraphrasing it. So basically, when you're rebalancing, you're selling things that are high and buying things that are low. The markets are actually trend and momentum based, man. That's why the S&P 500 works, because what happens is the S&P is market cap. The things that did well previously have a bigger market weight in the S&P 500, which typically means they'll have a bigger weight going forward and do better going forward. I mean, obviously that gravy train stops, but when does the trend and momentum stop? No one knows. So basically the S&P 500 is completely a trend and momentum. You did well before, you get a bigger market share of the S&P 500, which usually means you're going to do well again. At some point that stops, but no one knows when, where, how. So if you're rebalancing over this whole time, you've been rebalancing out of the S&P 500 the last 15 years into a portfolio of bonds, essentially, we just use that for example, that did not give you superior rates of return. It just did not. No, it could have reduced your risk, maybe, but certainly didn't give you superior rates of return. I'm not saying don't do this, by the way. I'm just saying it's not a free lunch. Last thing was he's saying basically a little bit more tactical, more money to our small caps and micro caps. And that, again, is a pet peeve of mine. I don't get why these old guys fall for this, man. It's crazy to me. Do they just not even read what the guy's name from Penn, Wharton, Jeremy Siegel? And again, I got the books back there, right there. Stocks the long run. Jeremy Siegel is very clear. What happened for small cap? The small cap premium was just a 6-year phenomenon, basically 77 to 83, because beginning of ERISA, all these other things as well. And as such, you can't sit there and say there's going to be a small cap premium, because I've talked about this a million times. You can't sit there and say there's going to be a small cap premium. So Bill Benga says a free lunch to overweight into small and micro caps. And I just said, based on what? In a 6-year time frame? That 6-year time frame, the S&P 500 did so much better. The small caps did so much better than the S&P 500. It makes anything. It's kind of like stocks versus bonds. You have a 20-year time frame with stocks and bonds. We talked about this when I interviewed my man, what the hell's his name, man? From Santa Clara. Macquarie, that's what, Ed Macquarie. He's a professor emeritus at Santa Clara. And we talked about this. If you're going to include any time about going back in time and saying stocks versus bonds, if you include the years from 1948 to basically 1968, it will be impossible. Those years are included not to come to the conclusion that stocks outperform bonds, because the stocks did so much better than bonds in that time. So again, if you were to rebalance during that time, you're not doing better as a performance, and you're not taking off less risk. You're just not. So free lunch. And the same thing happened with small caps. If you're going to include any period of time with small caps, and you're going to include the 70s to 80s, 1977 and 1983, small caps will look like they give you a value, increase in rates of return. But that was a one-time deal. Could it happen again? Sure, but it doesn't have to happen, because what was the certain anomalies that allowed that to happen? ERISA come to mind, for instance. So you can't just use that and say, well, historically this happened, thus that will happen. It's just no free lunch, man, this stuff. I'm not saying don't diversify. Remember, the S&P 500 is diversified. I mean, that's just a fact. There's 500 stocks in there. I mean, you could say they're heavy market capped, 35% or whatever is on tech and stuff. There's still 65% that's not. I mean, it's going to be more aggressive. That more aggressive is good on the upside too now. Don't forget, being standard deviation is downside risk, but it's upside potential as well. So I still like the barbell. You got cash or short-term bonds, and you got basically VTI. I don't really think there's a whole lot needed to do otherwise. Now, you can substitute VTI for Wellington or Fidelity Balance or something like that to add some bonds there. I got no qualm with that, but this is the diversification you need, in my opinion. And when the markets go up, you pull from VTI. And when the markets go down, you pull from this. If you want to add some bonds in there, like the Wellington Fund or Fidelity Balance, they'll make your portfolio less aggressive, which means less upside. Less aggressive means less upside. Less volatility, less standard deviation means less downside risk, potentially, and less upside gains. That's what it means. So anyway, there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to investing. All right, love to hear your thoughts. God bless. We'll see you.